Gonzaga is pursuing quite a few guards to add to the roster for next season, but who is and who should be at the top of the list?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you all by Monopoly Go. Folks, I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. Well, folks, it is Monday, and that means it is Mailbag Monday. For those of you who are new to the show, new to the program, welcome. Thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. Those of you who are everyday listeners, shout out to you as well. For Mailbag Monday, if you would like to be involved in Mailbag Monday, the easiest way to do it is to join our Discord channel. There's a link in the show notes. You click on that. You come hang out with us. There's over 300 of us, all Zag fans, talking Gonzaga basketball 24/7 there. You can post your questions in there and get them answered on the show. All right, lots of stuff to get to today. We're going to start with this question from Jules on Instagram. There is also a Locked On Zags Instagram. If you have not found that, go check that out as well. Regardless, Jules says, among players currently available for Gonzaga, either transfers or 2024 recruits, who are the five you'd most like to see on the team next season? Yeah, this is a great question. For those of you who have been listening to the show regularly, we've been doing recruiting updates, transfer portal updates, and one of the things I've been talking about quite a bit on the show is kind of the profile of what I think is the perfect player for Gonzaga to add to this roster, because as most of you know, the roster is pretty well set for next season. We still got a couple days till the transfer portal deadline closes. That will kind of help confirm that there's not going to be a shocking late addition into the portal. But as of right now, everybody who was on last year's roster is returning, who played a significant role outside of Anton Watson, who is out of eligibility. The Zags have replaced Anton Watson with Michael Ajayi, the transfer addition from Pepperdine. So it kind of doesn't look like there's a lot of extra room. But with Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman entering their final years of eligibility, in my mind, finding another guard who is going to have multiple years of eligibility feels like the perfect last piece for this roster. Somebody who will compete with Luka Krajinovic for minutes in the backcourt, somebody who won't necessarily need to have a big role this year, but will develop into somebody who could be a potential starter replacing either Nembhard or Hickman in the following year. There's a bunch of options. We've talked about every single one of the players I'm going to talk about here on the show already, because I don't want to toss any new names out there until we can do a full deep dive. Number one is Nolan Traore. 2024 freshman, incoming freshman, may not even go to college. He could just stay professionally in France, which is where he's currently playing, and declare for the NBA draft in 2025. He would be my top option because he's really, really, really good, but I do not see him coming to Gonzaga for a backup role unless he feels very confident that he needs 2 years before he goes to the NBA, in which case he could come to Gonzaga, learn the offense behind Nembhard and Hickman, be a third, fourth guard, step into a starting role in 2025, and become a guy who is in the NBA after 2 years. I don't see him wanting that necessarily, but if he did, he would be the perfect player to add to this team. Otherwise, there's Trent Perry, another incoming recruit in the 2024 class. It sounds very unlikely that he's going to come to Gonzaga. He was a recruited by Gonzaga before he committed to USC, ultimately decommitted from USC after Coach Andy Enfield took the head coaching job at Southern Methodist. Perry has done visits to Virginia, has looked at a handful of other places. Not sure how seriously Gonzaga is even on his radar right now, but I think for a lot of the same reasons I laid out with Traore, I think he would be a solid addition for that reasoning. There's also Wesley Yates. Wesley Yates spent his freshman year at UW, but he did not play because of a foot injury. He was previously recruited by Gonzaga. It sounds like there's Louisville is in the mix for him right now because his good friend Corin Johnson, who was on the UW team last year, has already gone to Louisville. So I think there's a connection there. There's some familial connections to Louisville as well. We also know Yates is currently visiting Oklahoma State as I'm recording this on Sunday. So he's looking at a handful of other places, but again, somewhat similar to Perry and Traore, young guard, lots of years still ahead of him. Very talented. Could end up being a guy who doesn't play much as a freshman but blossoms as a sophomore. The other two are Rowan Brumbaugh from Georgetown. Talked about him, I think, 2 weeks ago on the podcast. Freshman year at Texas, he redshirted last year as a redshirt freshman. He played for Georgetown. I don't think the Gonzaga has enough of a role to offer him for what he wants, but he's another young guard that I think would thrive in this system. And I talked about him late last week, so check that show out. It's actually Friday's show. Emmanuel Innocenti from Tarleton State, bigger guard, good rebounder, solid three-point shooter, Italian international student, played well at Tarleton State last year. Could see him coming to Gonzaga and ending up blossoming into a bigger player after a year kind of on the bench. Next question here comes from Austin via Discord. Austin says, with the UW series now complete and with UW having a new coach, do you think the series will be renewed? I do think so, but it's worth acknowledging that the Big Ten and the SEC and the Big 12, for that matter, are basically trying to make as many conference games as possible, which limits these teams' ability to play those non-conference games. It's yet another way that college basketball's power right now is consolidating as much as they possibly can and really squeezing out those mid-major programs. And while Gonzaga is not a mid-major in the sense of how they recruit and how they schedule and various things like that, if these conferences are going to play as many games as they possibly can against each other, those teams are going to look for those SWAC games, those regional games against not very good teams, more than likely in their non-conference. They're going to fill their non-conference with the Texas Southerns and Jackson States and whatnot of the world, as opposed to Gonzaga, and it could hurt them. That's a longer conversation for another time, but I think Danny Sprinkle in Washington is going to want to continue this series because it's advantage. It's good for them. It's good for their brand. It's good for recognition. It's good for rivalries. I think Gonzaga is going to want to do the same as well. But I caution that this could be something that is harder and harder for these teams to continue to do going forward. And it leads well into Austin's next question on a similar topic. He says, if you could pick one team from each of the following conferences, SEC, ACC, Big 10, Big 12, and Big East, which teams would you want to have a home-and-home series with? You can't pick Kentucky or UConn because we already got series with them. Sounds good to me. Let's go through it. SEC, if we're not picking Kentucky, I'm going Florida. Let's play Todd Golden. I would love that. Todd Golden, fantastic coach, of course, came from San Francisco. I think it'd be really fun for Gonzaga and Florida to face off. I'll have Arkansas be the close second just because I like beating John Calipari, so why not keep that train going? ACC, it's Duke. It's always Duke. It will always be Duke. North Carolina second. Nobody else particularly high on my list right there. It's basically Duke and Carolina, and anybody else is, okay, that's fine. But those are the two at the top. Big Ten, let's go UCLA. I guess a lot of the other Big Ten teams, I'm not super enthused, like the traditional Big Ten teams, not super enthused about a home and home with them. But UCLA, always fun to play Mick Cronin's team, always fun to beat Mick Cronin's team. My second pick there, I guess, would be UW. Let's just keep that train going there. Big 12, Baylor. Again, kind of an obvious one. As much as Kansas is great, as much as Houston is great, Iowa State is great. I would actually have BYU second just because of the regional aspect, the former rivalry that took place, of course, during the WCC. But if I had to pick one Big 12 team, give me Baylor for sure and Scott Drew's team. And then the Big East, again, since UConn's already on the schedule, let's go Creighton. The Ryan Nembhard battle of it all. Grant Gibbs, for those older Gonzaga fans, tossing it back a little bit there. Greg McDermott's a great coach. I think Gonzaga and Creighton have had some really fantastic battles in non-conference and in the NCAA tournament in the past. So they'd be my top choice. If it's not UConn, if it's not Creighton, it's Marquette is definitely the next option there as well. Well, folks, who might be the surprise team in the WCC this upcoming season? And is it okay to feel bad for St. Mary's with Aiden Mahaney and Joshua Jefferson out the door? We're going to discuss that and more. But first, I want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, folks, game off. We got to pause right here to talk about Monopoly Go. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for times tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much to get. Unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults, plus Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every single day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now for free on the Google Play or the App Store. Game on. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still going through Mailbag Monday here. This next question comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, in the era of big money college athletics over the past 40 years, is there anything more remarkable than the rise of Gonzaga from obscurity into a nationally recognized name and a major national basketball power over the past 25 years? Yeah, I'd say UConn winning 5 titles in the past 25 years is a little bit more impressive, or I guess the past 26 years. That feels like kind of the biggest story is that this UConn team certainly wasn't as obscure as Gonzaga was in 1999. In fact, UConn won their first title in 1999. But prior to that, they had not been a particularly good team in the Big East. And so I think like the storyline, I mean, and especially if you're talking about going back 40 years ago, UConn had barely even been heard of. And now they've won 5 national championships. Like, it's insane what they've been able to do over this last streak of time. And I think Gonzaga has been more consistently good in that period of time, but UConn has bounced around to conferences and is still in the position that they're in. So I would say UConn is a bigger story, like a more remarkable rise than Gonzaga's has been. Outside of that, I'm not sure there's many other really big ones. I think Baylor should be in this conversation as well for the basketball side, in particular, men's and women's basketball. Obviously, UConn men's and women's basketball is the top. Gonzaga men's and women's basketball, for that matter, is probably right around there. And then Baylor, I think Scott Drew took over a program that was just in complete disarray, has led them to an actual national championship. Baylor has won national championships on the women's side. Like, just an incredible story for Baylor's basketball to have turned around the way that it has in the last couple of decades. Next question here comes from Christian via Gmail. Christian says, way too early speculation question. What team in the WCC could be the biggest riser or surprise this upcoming season? Right now, it feels like it's LMU. They have all the kind of momentum in that direction towards being that kind of rising team. And we thought that last year, and they kind of fell a little flat after losing Cam Shelton the previous year. So, but this year, they brought in Lorenzo Romar as an associate head coach. He brought with him Javon Porter from Pepperdine. Javon Porter was an all-WCC player. Now he comes to the LMU, fills that similar role. Going to be a great floor spacing big for them. They bring in a couple freshmen who were initially committed to Pepperdine, who have followed Romar over to LMU. They also get Jan Vide from UCLA, a guy that Gonzaga recruited internationally before he ended up going to UCLA. They also get Matar Diop from Nebraska. So a couple high major transfers coming in. Really good player in Javon Porter. They do lose Dominic Harris, who's officially committed to UCLA. They lose Justin Wright, who's committed to UNC Asheville. They lose Michael Graham, who committed to Hofstra. So they got some guys out the door. But I think that ultimately this team is going to be significantly better this year than they were last year. And I think we're going to see that play out on the court. I would add Santa Clara in here as well. They get Carlos Stewart back. He transferred to LSU, had injuries, didn't play all that well, comes back. He was an all-WCC performer before he left. If Adama Alpha Ball comes back, you have Alpha Ball and Stewart in the backcourt. Santa Clara is going to be good yet again. Next question comes from Strike Nowhere on Discord, who says, got into a bit of a Twitter intra-Zag debate about the Gales' sudden woes, and I'm wondering, is it okay to feel bad for the Gales and their program? Us Zag fans experienced pain in the transfer portal last year, but not nearly to this extent. Some people are dancing on the Gales' grave, while I personally wouldn't wish this on them from both a selfish standpoint, a stronger St. Mary's equals better metrics for Gonzaga, and from a fan standpoint, knowing that losing players and likely dropping out of league contention sucks. The Zags are able to weather the boons and banes that the transfer portal grants better than most schools, but St. Mary's simply isn't equipped to handle such a blow. Okay, 2 things here that I want to address. First of all, I think we're talking about the demise of St. Mary's prematurely. Whether we're talking about it from a, hey, people are dancing on their graves and I don't agree with that standpoint, or, hey, I feel really bad for them because they're not going to be able to come back from this. Both of those are premature in my mind. Yes, it is really hard to replace an Aiden Mahaney. And getting a player like Aiden Mahaney, who grew up 5 minutes from campus and is just always wanted to play there and came to your program and was immediately great, that is rare. Even for a program as good as St. Mary's, it's rare. I get that. And losing him after 2 years sucks. It's really a bummer. Historically in college basketball, that'd be a 4-year guy who'd have a statue or a poster or something outside the arena. Sucks that doesn't happen anymore. Joshua Jefferson, similar story. The development from freshman year to sophomore year was massive, and he bounces after that. It sucks. I get it. But St. Mary's already brought in players. They bring in a transfer from Arizona. I think that they're going to be fine. I think Gonzaga is going to be better than them next year, but that's kind of historically been the case. I don't think they're going to drop to like 5th or 6th or anything like that. So my first point would be that we're talking about the death of St. Mary's too prematurely. My second point would be something I say on this show a lot, which is that I don't want to tell people how to be a fan. And I recognize that I typically say that phrase right before saying something that kind of can come across like I'm telling somebody how to be a fan. I get it. I have self-awareness. I understand that that's what's happening in those moments. But here's my point. If somebody is telling you, anybody out there, that you have to fan a certain way, that, oh, you're a Gonzaga fan, so you have to hate St. Mary's. You have to be happy that they're losing their best player. You have to be somebody who doesn't think Aiden Mahaney is going to be good anywhere else and you're trashing him. You have to feel this way. Just ignore them. If they're telling you you have to act a certain way because you're a fan of Gonzaga basketball, they are wrong. They are wrong. It is as simple as that. You do not have to act any way at all. You don't. I don't think that being a fan of any team means that you are required to hate the rival. You should root for your team. If you're rooting for the rival, then I would question your fandom. Sure, but that's not what's happening here. I think the argument that St. Mary's being worse is bad for Gonzaga, that's a completely valid argument, and it is true. It is true. If St. Mary's drops metrically significantly this year to next year, I know a lot of Gonzaga fans will be happy because, St. Mary's is bad, but it's not good for Gonzaga. And going back to a point made previously in the show, if Gonzaga is not able to schedule as many marquee non-conference opponents, St. Mary's suddenly plummeting, again, which I don't think is going to happen, but let's use that as an example. That's not good for the Zags at all. It's bad. So I think that that's a reasonable reason to feel bad for St. Mary's. And also I think just like, hey, I feel for the fans of this program. You know, St. Mary's does not have the resources Gonzaga has. The point that they can't weather the storm as well as Gonzaga is true, even if I think that we're prematurely calling the death of St. Mary's. But yes, they do not have the ability to recover from this as easily as somebody like Gonzaga might be able to. And that is frustrating for them. So I would say anybody who's telling you have to act a certain way because you're a fan, just ignore them. Just ignore them. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. If you want to feel bad for St. Mary's, feel bad for St. Mary's. Frankly, I do. And I'm a huge Gonzaga fan. I feel bad for them. Doesn't mean I don't want to see us kick their teeth in 3 times next year, but it still sucks that this has happened to them and that, yeah, like you said, it's going to impact Gonzaga from a scheduling perspective as well. Final question of the segment here comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, since 2011, when the NCAA tournament expanded to 68 teams, much has been made about it being harder and harder for non-power conference teams to compete. Yet since 2011, we have seen a large amount of March Madness upsets, including the only 2 16 wins over 1 seed. So if it is becoming harder and harder for non-power teams to compete, how is it that we are seeing more upsets in March Madness and not less? I don't agree with the premise. I'm not sure who has been out there saying that it's harder for non-power teams to compete. The NCAA tournament, the parity in college basketball has been at an all-time high. That's documented. Not only have we seen the only 2 16 seeds upset a 1 seed, the number of 15 seeds over 2 seeds in the last 7 or 8 years has been astronomically higher than it ever was prior to that. I don't believe the premise that it is harder for non-power conference teams to compete is necessarily accurate. Now, in the very recent couple of years, the transfer portal has really decimated mid-major teams. And I do think that if that continues without some level of regulation, which we will talk about in the third segment of the show, that it's going to get worse. Everybody says, well, yeah, the players are going up and down. The mid-major conferences are losing a bunch of talent to the high major teams, but some of those guys are trickling down. And yes, that's true, but the rate at which those things are happening is not anywhere close to comparable. It's not. It's not. And I think that we are going to see an era, if this era continues the way that it is currently, it is going to be harder and harder for those mid-major teams to compete. But I don't agree with the premise that since 2011, we have thought that it's been harder for mid-major teams to compete. If there are people out there who have been saying that, which I don't think Jeff is making this up, I'm sure it's coming from somewhere, I would have just never agreed with them in the first place. And I think that the data we've seen in the tournament lately with, 14 seeds over 3 seeds and 15 seeds over 2 seeds and the 2 16 seeds over 1 seed, not to mention in the regular season this year, more ranked teams went on the road and lost to unranked opponents than ever before. Ever before. The rate of teams losing on the road to unranked opponents this year was it was 50%. In the past, it's been 25 to 30%. It is very clear that there is more parity currently in college basketball than there has been probably ever, at least not in a long time. So I just don't agree with the overall premise that we've been believing non-power teams can't compete since 2011. They have clearly been able to do so. Well, folks, is the transfer portal good as it is, or does it need some tweaking? We're going to talk about that and more coming up in just a second. But first, I want to tell you that today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time right now in the NBA and the NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets. That's guaranteed. $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. If you're looking ahead to the 2025 NCAA tournament, Gonzaga currently at 2,500 to 1 odds to win it all that next year. It's already dropped. At the end of the season, it was plus 3,000. Now it's plus 2,500. So if you want to maximize those odds, what are you waiting for? You got to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is also brought to you by Gametime. Folks, the weather is finally starting to heat up, and that means it is time to take in some Major League Baseball games. And great news, Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app, folks, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. One of my favorite features on Gametime is their last-minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And I often worry about my tickets being fake, but with Gametime's ticketing coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still going through Mailbag Monday here as we get to the end of the month of April. This question here comes from Austin via Discord. Austin says, as of right now, Gonzaga doesn't have any incoming freshmen, so let's talk about the most popular freshman entering college basketball, Cooper Flagg. His player rating on On3 is 99.74. Chet Holmgren's was 100 even. I know it's tough to know now, but who do you think will be the most impactful freshman? Impactful is a very key word here. Here's what I'm going to say. Cooper Flagg is going to put up bigger numbers at Duke than Chet Holmgren put up at Gonzaga, most likely. Similarly to how Paolo Banchero put up bigger numbers at Duke than Chet Holmgren did at Gonzaga, despite an argument that Chet Holmgren's a more impactful player. Paolo's a better scorer. He was a better scorer in college. He's been a better scorer in the NBA. But Chet has a lot of ways he impacts the game differently. Chet is like the most elite role player ever, because he's not a ball-dominant scorer. He's a great defensive player. He's a great three-point shooter, moves well without the ball. Like, he does the things that you consider role players doing, just at like the elitist level that you possibly can. Cooper Flagg is not going to be a role player at Duke. In fact, Duke's entire roster has basically turned around. They lost multiple players to the NBA, and Jared McCain and Kyle Filipowski. Jeremy Roach entered the transfer portal. They're had 6 other guys alongside Jeremy Roach enter the transfer portal. They're rebuilding a roster with this incoming freshman class, with Tyrese Proctor returning, and with Cooper Flagg. And you can tell by the way John Shire is navigating the transfer portal currently that they're basically trying to add role players around Cooper Flagg to let him have the ball and just dominate. Mason Gillis from Purdue, they added him. He's a 40% standstill three-point shooter in the corner who played a valuable role for Purdue without taking the ball away from Braden Smith or Fletcher Loyer or, of course, Zach Edey. Malik Brown's coming over from Syracuse. Malik Brown was used to basically cleaning up the glass for Judah Mintz, who was their star player, who's now in the NBA draft process. Duke is adding role players to fill a roster around Cooper Flagg. I think he's going to put up huge numbers as a freshman. And I don't think anybody will say that Chet Holmgren was a better freshman than Cooper Flagg, whether they're right or not, because Chet's efficiency numbers and his overall impact, including defense, was incredibly high level. Now, Cooper Flagg is a great defensive prospect as well. So if he's highly impactful defensively and puts up huge offensive numbers, which is what I expect to happen, then I don't think there will be much debate. But few players on the entire planet are actually better than Chet Holmgren. They just might make an impact in ways that are more digestible for the regular fan base. Next question comes from Christian via Gmail. Christian says, what coaching hire or move do you believe will have the biggest impact in all of college basketball? Yeah, I think you have to say Mark Pope. at Kentucky because it's Kentucky. What's happening at Kentucky basketball is incredibly relevant around all of college basketball all the time, forever. Their brand is so synonymous with college basketball that how Mark Pope does will have a bigger impact on college basketball than pretty much any other move that happens. I have said this on this show. I've said it more on Locked On College Basketball for those of you who check out that show. But effectively, Mark Pope's going to have to prove he can recruit. Recruiting at BYU is really hard, so you kind of got to give him a pass. Also, he's been a good recruiter at BYU, but people said, oh, he didn't get a lot of 5 stars at BYU. Like, yeah, it's because it's BYU. He's going to get 5 stars at Kentucky. And if he can do that, if he can navigate recruiting at a super high level, can navigate the transfer portal, can add the right pieces to fit his offense, I think he's going to turn Kentucky around. Not right away, but I think that this is a really good hire for Kentucky. And I think that in 2 to 3 years, it's going to look really, really good. But regardless of whether it goes well or it goes poorly, the most impact that any coaching change will have on college basketball this offseason will likely be Mark Pope at Kentucky. With apologies and respect to Dusty May going to Michigan, because I think that's a huge move that shakes up the Big Ten in a significant way. With apologies to Danny Sprinkle going to Washington. I think Danny Sprinkle's an incredible basketball coach, but I'm just not sure that Washington coaching hire is going to move the needle all that much. With apologies to what would probably be my second pick, Pat Kelsey, going to Louisville, only because Louisville's been so bad the last couple of years that them turning it around and being good is a pretty seismic change in college basketball. It changed the landscape of the ACC, which currently has been dominated by Duke and Carolina, and Virginia's been in that mix a little bit. But if Louisville's all of a sudden back to being who the Cardinals are capable of being, that's a pretty big change. So to me, it's Pope and Kelsey are the two biggest ones. John Calipari going to Arkansas, I think Arkansas is just going to be what Kentucky was, just in red, basically. High-level recruits, a lot of NBA talent, very little NCAA tournament success. So that just doesn't really move the needle all that much for me. So to me, the answer is Pope or Kelsey, with May and Sprinkle and a couple others kind of right behind them in that hierarchy. Next question here comes from Christian again. Christian says, which of these statements do you believe the most and why? The transfer portal is indicative of free market capitalism and should remain as presently constructed. Number 2, the transfer portal needs a few adjustments. Number 3, the transfer portal needs a complete overhaul. I kind of agree with all 3, and I know that's the point of the question, so I will give a firmer answer, which is number 2, which I guess is kind of the cop-out answer. It's in the middle there. I do agree that the transfer portal should mimic like the real world. And in the real world, you can change jobs and you can search jobs out for more money. And as I think Greg Gard, the coach at Wisconsin, said this in an interview recently, he said, anybody would go take another job where they get paid 3 times as much to do the same job. Like all people who are complaining about the transfer portal would do that. And he's right. And I fundamentally agree with that being mad at players for taking more money to go elsewhere feels backwards. That's the point of literally capitalism and the American system, is to go make money by doing what you do best. So telling players they shouldn't do that feels wrong. But at the same time, there needs to be some regulation. Something needs to, it is less regulated in college basketball and college football than in the NFL and the MLB and NBA. Like there is literally more regulations regarding tampering, contracts, player movement in professional leagues than there is in college. That is obviously a flawed issue. That needs to change. I don't think it's really hard for me to see how anybody could argue against some level of change right now in the transfer portal. We had, as I'm recording this, we just saw this kid who was at Missouri, John Tanji. He hit the transfer portal. He announced he was going to New Mexico on his social media accounts and then went to Wisconsin. like that's just, something is wrong with the way the system is right now. The answer is far above my pay grade and is more nuanced than I'm capable of explaining in a 30-minute podcast. But it's going to need to be unionized in contracts. Like there's no real other way that I think that this works. Players can sign a 1-year contract, 2-year contract, 3-year contract, 4-year contract. The coaching staff, whoever they bring in to kind of fill that general manager role, and the player negotiate that, and player's agent. It's going to look like the pros. If you're an obvious one and done candidate, you sign a 1-year, you sign a 1-year contract. If you're a player going to a mid-major level and you're confident that you're going to be good enough at that level to go to the next level, you sign a 1-year contract. But if you sign a 2-year contract and after 1 year you want to go somewhere else, there's penalties. I don't think you're forced to say no, but maybe the penalty is you sit out a year. And then there's exceptions, as we've had in the past. Coaching changes, there's an exception. You can then transfer for free. Hardships, there's still a hardship waiver exception that you could apply through for the NCAA. A lot of it starts to look the same after that. That's my pick, my solution. Having worked in college athletics, I am very aware at how complicated that is. Far more complicated than I think people might really understand. But I don't see any other way that this gets resolved that's not complete chaos. So that's my early pitch, my early solution to this, knowing the incredible amount of complication that would come with it, because the way it's currently going just cannot be sustainable long term. Final question of the show here comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, in the modern era, where do you think Gonzaga's run of making the Sweet 16 9 straight NCAA tournaments ranks among accomplishments by teams not in power conferences? Jeff also listed a handful of accomplishments in football and basketball and baseball for teams that were in non-power conferences. It was a very helpful list. I'm not going to read through all of it right now, but I think Gonzaga's accomplishment falls below the accomplishments of teams that have won actual national titles in basketball or football. I think UNLV as a mid-major team in 1990, 1991, or 89, 90, whenever it was, they made back-to-back Final Fours and they won a national championship. That's incredible. Butler, of course, also made back-to-back national championship appearances in the Horizon League. Also incredible, but they didn't win one. I'd take Gonzaga making 9 straight Sweet 16s over Butler making 2 straight national championship appearances. Granted, those are close in my mind, but UNLV making 2 straight and winning one of them, that's higher on the list. I think Gonzaga falls similarly to the Boise State tremendous run that they had under Coach Chris Peterson in the football level with the Fiesta Bowl and all the tremendous accomplishments that they had under Coach Peterson at Boise State. That's kind of where I feel like Gonzaga is right there. I would acknowledge that UConn won one of their titles was while they were in the American Athletic Conference, but they'd previously been in the Big East. They went back to the Big East. So that one doesn't feel quite as in the spirit of the same argument because they were kind of only briefly not a power program, but it's still kind of in that conversation as well. So Gonzaga is probably not quite at the top. The 9 straight Sweet 16s, I don't think, but it is very close. They have been one of the most successful non-Power 6 programs, specifically for men's basketball, that we've ever seen, and I don't think there's any debate about that. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank all of you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We will be back this week continuing our season in review series. We're also going to continue to talk about recruiting and the transfer portal, continue to keep you up to date on our Zags and the NBA playoffs as well. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.